So this week we finally got to see what's in this so-called border bill that the Senate cooked up, and Langford, the so-called Republican behind it, even though he's still holding on to it. I think Mitch McConnell has kind of abandoned him a bit. But this whole bill, and looking at it, reminded us of a document that we came across a while ago from the State Department, which kind of blew our minds in terms of what's going on there. So the State Department has something called the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau. And once you dig a bit into what these guys get up to, I mean, it just gets absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it's kind of funny, Hans, because I mean, I'm sure you remember, like, I sent this document to you and said, what fresh hell is this? How many people are aware that the State Department has a division called the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration? And I don't even remember where we came by this, but it was a report that was a presentation to Congress from this division. And looking through there, you suddenly started to realize, like, holy smokes, there's a lot of money contained within this department, and it's being allocated to the UN. And, as this border bill came up, everybody, I think by now, is probably pretty familiar with all the fatal flaws within this thing. But it is worth noting that they carved out about $2.6 billion of funds that were to be used to fund various NGOs. And that's what ties in directly to this document from the State Department. We've had this enormous flood of refugees coming to the U.S. And we kept seeing these caravans and caravan after caravan. And I think everybody sort of realized, like, hey, this doesn't feel particularly organic. This feels like it's something beyond just sort of a sense that the U.S. borders are porous. This feels a lot more organized. And people, as they began to do work, they started realizing that, hey, wait, there's kind of a whole, just a corridor of way stations that are set up from all the way down in deep Latin America, all the way up through Central America, and then through Mexico to the United States. So there's this whole infrastructure that now exists that provides, food, shelter, clothing, but it also provides money, both in the form of debit cards, actual outright cash transfers to these people's bank accounts. So it's financially facilitating the flow of people that want to come in illegally from Latin America to the U.S. And it turns out we're the ones that are directly paying for that. And the more, we started to dig into this, the more I found myself almost in a perennial stage of outrage for the last week over this. The UN funds a lot of these way stations in this process directly, but the UN is getting a lot of their money from us. And there's two sources for this. Everybody knows about the dues that we pay to the UN. And I believe for 23, it was about $4 billion that we paid to the UN. However, there's another sort of off-the-book source of funds to the UN that is actually much larger than our formal dues. And it comes in the form of these sort of charitable contributions that are disseminated by federal agencies, including the State Department, USAID, others. And what happens is they get a larger amount of funding from Congress that's sent to these various entities that allows them to make charitable donations if they want. The aggregate limit is generally sort of established by Congress, but it's not specified where it goes, who it goes to, how it's allocated. Those decisions are made by the executive office. So this PRM division within the State Department is more or less dedicated wholly to this. They wrap themselves in a noble cause of refugees across the globe, etc. But what they're really doing is they're sending money to the UN to fund these way stations that are funneling the immigrants up to us. And just again, the aggregate amount of money that's set to give charitable donations that are kind of off-the-book donations to the UN, $7 billion versus $4 billion formal dues from the U.S. to the United Nations. So we're talking big money. And we know that the State Department made one of the largest of these donations, $1 billion. Another very large one was made by USAID, and that was about $460 million. Now, in the context of setting up the infrastructure and setting up these way stations, these are enormous amounts of money. So it's literally our own State Department, as directed by the executive office, i.e. Joe Biden, the Biden administration, are funneling these proceeds that are enabling the refugees, not only allowing them to make the journey, but they're setting up the infrastructure to induce them to make the journey here. So the illegal immigration that's hitting us, if you want to cut to the chase of it, it's being paid by you.
Yeah, no, that this is obviously very important to overcome this narrative, this false narrative. And, I have to admit, I was not until recently, but until maybe 5 years ago or something like that, I was probably prone to believing in that false narrative as well, where there's sort of two types we all know about these people being brought over by gangs and groups and so on. Okay, that's sort of been a given. But
Right.
then the rest of them, the narrative that's been sort of created is that these are just like people who they kind of get up one morning and start walking in these caravans, and they're just kind of just random people, and then just kind of get to the border and walk across the border, and then they're kind of on their own. And that's sort of the narrative anyway. What you laid out here is so important, and it's so important to get that message out and to really overcome the false narrative on this, which is that there's an entire infrastructure behind it. There's an entire system behind it. There's a system of funding behind it. There's a system of NGOs behind it. As you said, there's way stations. It's not like you start walking in Nicaragua one day, and then a couple of months later you arrive at the border. Everything is sort of planned, and there's a lot of involvement of a lot of groups. And then, of course, the cherry on top, as you say, is the fact that a lot of this is being funded by United States taxpayers. Just absolutely incredible. And if I can throw in this as an aside that always kind of goes to the same point, but again, that message isn't really getting through. And again, I admit that I'm still blown away every time we hear about these things, even though I know, but it's just every time, again, it's like, what? It's the amount of people who are not from South and Middle America who are part of these people who cross the border, say, for instance, Chinese nationals. How on earth does that even work? I mean, again, you can't just, first of all, in China, you're not allowed to travel. You need to get permission to travel. It's not like a free country. And you're certainly not allowed to just get on a plane and fly somewhere. And you're not allowed to get on a boat and just go somewhere. So somehow all these people have to get to Mexico, and then wherever they arrive in Mexico, they have to get to the border, and then they have to cross the border, and then they have to be received, and they have to, so again, just that one example tells you that this is organized and there's a lot of infrastructure behind it. And I really hope that people interested in this topic, and GOP in particular, can start pushing this point, because it's so important to break through this narrative that these are just random people who just kind of go on a walk and end up at the border.
This is not an organic movement. It
Right.
is not just people that suddenly wake up and say, hey, I'm going to try to make it to the U.S. I'm sure those people are intermingled in there, and there's probably a natural well of a reservoir of people who would rather be in the U.S. than where they are, but they're literally being induced. They're being told that, hey, we're going to get you there. We're going to provide food. We're going to provide shelter. We're going to, in some cases, provide transportation. We're going to provide money. We're going to give you cash. We can make transfers directly to your phone. We can make transfers to your bank account. In some cases, we're going to give you debit cards. All of these are now documented. And that funding is coming through the U.S. And you raise a great question. There's a whole nother level of infrastructure that we're obviously not seeing, because we have these Chinese nationals that are now setting up camp and making their way here. We've all seen people visit the border, and lo and behold, everybody that's crossing it at certain points from Africa. How did they didn't organically end up at the southern border. And, that's a hard journey unto itself. How did they get from Africa down somewhere into Mexico, or perhaps even further down in Latin America, to make their way to that border? So there's a whole industry that's going on here. And let me just read you a couple of things. This is out of, the PRM report that we're talking about. And this is the State Department Bureau that, frankly, I didn't even know existed. PRM plans to build out new NGO programming to augment its Mexico and Central America response. And they continue, and they say in Central America and Mexico, PRM support helps government officials and civil society to identify, screen, protect, and assist vulnerable migrants, and to strengthen national asylum systems and other protection capacities. Now, notice what's being said there. Not only is humanitarian aid being established for these people, for the existing migrants being put into place, they're creating the underlying infrastructure to enable flow of migrants and induce them by making it very easy. So at the outset of the journey, it appears that they're literally trying to pull people into a migrant stream and then make it very simple for them to traverse all the way up to our border. I know, by the way, we'll get into it a little bit, but it gets even worse because then they facilitate the dissemination of these people throughout every congressional district in the U.S.
Yep. Now, all of that, exactly right. Now, the other issue that kind of comes up with all this is does there need to be a new bill, a new law to take care of this? And of course it doesn't. I mean, there are already existing laws. You can't just walk across the border. And even if we take what you just read for, if we say that's genuine or, there's a real need there or whatever, let's just assume that, right? These assessments need to be made in the country where they arrive. That's the normal way this works. So if they made it all the way to Mexico, well, then that's the place where this assessment needs to take place. There's no right to just come to the border and just walk across the border. So, but these points are never discussed. In the old days after the Vietnam War, there were a lot of genuine refugees because, of course, that country was a total mess, and there were these so-called boat people back then. So they got on boats and many just crammed on like these wooden little things and just tried to get somewhere. Now, one of the places they'd like to go to was Hong Kong, which was British at the time, because they wouldn't be sent back. But it wasn't as easy of just arrive and you're there. What happened is they arrived and then they were put in camps while their applications were being processed. Now, if you made that kind of suggestion, you'd probably be declared, people would shout at you or whatever. You can't just put people in camps or whatever. But I'm just demonstrating that that's the idea, that if you are genuinely seeking refuge, there's a process you go through. And obviously that's not the case here, especially because of this being so organized. Let's say someone's seeking refuge and these groups are helping, the ones that are funded by the State Department. Well, why are they helping the people get to the border rather than helping the people with getting their process started wherever they are, especially if they're already in a safe haven country? By the way, Europe has the same problem where a lot of these refugees from Africa and other places, they want to get to Syria, of course, a big source. They want to get to places like England or Germany. They have to pass through all these other countries. Well, that's not supposedly how it works. Supposedly how it works is where you arrive. Let's say you arrive in Greece. Well, then that's your country. But they don't want to be in Greece. So they're not really seeking, refuge. What they're seeking is to go and live in a place like England. England is another huge example of this. That's always blown me away for as long as it's been going on. England has its own kind of boat problem where there's bunches of people that arrive every day on little dinghies. And they come over from France. And I'm like, France isn't such a bad country. France is actually quite a nice country. So if this is purely about like what these people say it is, refuge, but what's so bad with France? Why would you risk, this trip in a little dinghy across the English Channel? And that just basically tells you what this is all about. This is about going to a very specific place with very specific intentions. Now, the intentions on the part of these people may be a better life or, whatever. But the people who organize it might have very different intentions.
It's, there's been this incredible sort of a dispense. The idea of a refugee has been completely blown open to include anybody who happens to be trying to get into the country. As you said, it used to be there was legitimate refugees. And of course, there still are legitimate refugees. But that definition has been blown open to include anybody who effectively wants to come into our country, and there hasn't really been any pushback on that. They just call them refugees, and the more you call them refugees, the more everybody becomes a refugee. And there hasn't been any real concerted effort to say, wait a minute, a lot of these people aren't refugees; they're just coming here because they want to. You can't fault people for that. The United States has always been kind of a beacon of hope for people. It's it's always stood out as a place where you can, truly make your way in the world. There's no doubt a lot of people want to come here, and properly managed immigration can elevate a country. But this is something entirely different. And it's being orchestrated by a lot of faith-based NGOs that are being funded by the NGO. Mike Howell over at the Heritage Foundation actually was pointing fingers at the Catholic Church, in particular the Jesuit division within that, and said that they're the 800-pound gorilla in this. Those are his words, not mine. But there's a lot of people, and I have no doubt that many of these people have very good intentions and are doing the work out of their own personal beliefs or whatever. But they're these are the people that are receiving the funds. It's the Catholic Charities has got something like these faith-based charities. I think they just got, let me find the number here. I believe it's like $372 million to allocate in cash and voucher assistance. So we keep seeing these kind of flows coming in to these faith-based charities. And it goes a little further than that, because these same charities also help to disseminate people out throughout the United States. So earlier we said the effort doesn't just stop when they reach the border. What appears to be going on, Hans, is that there's a very coordinated effort to ensure that all of the illegal immigrants are dispersed in relatively homogeneous way throughout the entirety of the United States. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is obviously it makes it a lot harder to get deportation. Let's say if Trump wins and comes in and wants to start deporting people, it makes it a lot harder to do if they're not concentrated in any given area. And two, it cuts to the base in terms of voting. It spreads the effect of, what's kind of inherently, largely speaking, a left-leaning voting bloc is now disseminated across the entirety of the United States.
Yeah, and Elon Musk made this point, and then he got pushback because people, they distorted what's going on. Now, obviously, these people, all these millions of newcomers, won't be voting this year. But the idea that because, some might, I guess, but in terms of getting a passport and getting regularized and so on, that's going to take a while. But number one, don't underestimate the incentives and the thinking in terms of Democrats and all these NGOs and so on, just basically leftist groups in general, to play a long game. Many of them play a very long game, and they're very successful.
They've always played a long game, exactly.
Number one. And number two, there is an immediate or much more immediate effect, which is the part that Elon said that was distorted, is if you have a lot more people somewhere, that place gets more representation in Congress and in terms of the electoral votes, even if they're not citizens. And so you kind of distort things that way. And in other words, they don't need to be citizens in order to have an impact on the election picture.
Yeah. These NGOs are also, they're not just passive in the sense of working to, create way stations and bring people up. They're also politically active in terms of lobbying the Biden administration and Congress to go ahead and keep the border open. So, and Heritage, again, did some work on this and demonstrated that was factually so. So it's kind of this full-scale operation. But there's something else that they did that I found fascinating. And they concerned themselves with, okay, where are these people going? Which is a question that I don't think gets addressed often enough. So we know the flood comes across our border. Where do these people go? Do they just stay in Texas? Well, as it turns out, no, they don't. And the way that they know this, it was very creative, is they focused on a couple major facilities, one of which with Catholic Charities of Texas, a couple NGO facilities that are on U.S. soil, but just across from the border, where, effectively the refugee processing centers. What they really are is when the Border Protection Service gets overwhelmed, that's where they send these people, is to these primary facilities. And they found about 30,000 randomized, anonymized cell phones that were traceable at these facilities. So in other words, they set up this geo-scanning where they're able to say, okay, we've got about 20,000 at this facility. We got 8,000 over here. We got 5,000 here. Let's keep those numbers. Let's continue the geo-tracking, and let's see where they go, and let's see how quickly they go. Well, as it turns out, for the one that was run by the UN, I think it was about 22,000 cell phone numbers that they had. And yeah, 22,000 unique mobile devices that were located. The devices were later traced to 431 separate U.S. congressional districts out of 435 total in the U.S. In other words, they were being equally distributed throughout the United States. The refugees are not, the illegal immigrants aren't doing this of their own volition. They're being taken there. Another set of data, they had another 8,400 unique mobile devices. They tracked them to 434 out of 435 congressional districts. So, if you think about the implications of this, it's pretty disturbing. There's a whole shadow or structure that's been built up in the United States to spread the illegal immigrants that are crossing the border and resettle them everywhere. And, for me, one of the things that, frankly, that immediately leaped to mind, how Governor Abbott's being lauded as a kind of hero in the media for standing up to the Biden administration. And it began when he began busing immigrants to other places. And it's always kind of bothered me because I've never been as big of a fan of Abbott. He really helped to shift Texas purple by drawing in big tech companies into Texas, and that really altered the political makeup of that state. And if you think about what he was doing with these immigrants, dispersing them throughout the U.S., he's actually mimicking perfectly what was already being done by these NGOs. So if you take kind of a jaded viewpoint of that, and I tend to take that viewpoint, his actions happen to be perfectly paralleling what the NGOs were already doing. So again, it's deeply disturbing to think that these guys are distributed equidistantly amongst all the districts in the U.S., all the corners of the United States.
Right. No, I completely agree. And it's so disturbing that there's so much planning, coordination, infrastructure, and so on, kind of beneath the surface that is behind all this. If we really cut to the chase here, we're only talking about two categories of people. There are genuine refugees. So, for instance, if Xi Jinping suddenly from the Wuhan lab suddenly arrived at JFK airport and had a story to tell, then she's a genuine refugee because her colleague Zhao Yuzhen fell off a roof, by accident, I guess, when he might have had something to say about COVID's origin back in 2020. This is the guy who miraculously came up with a so-called vaccine like within a few weeks or days even, which always was very suspicious because it suggested that he already kind of knew about this virus beforehand. Okay, that's just an extreme example, but these people exist. People exist who genuinely need to be protected. No question about that. But everyone else is not in that category, and that's it. Those are the two categories you have, and that's fine. And I'm not saying other people shouldn't come, but what always bothers me so much about this whole debate is that there are millions and millions of people waiting in line in that second category. And it could take 10 years, 12 years, 15 years, or not at all. And
the people that are abiding by the law are not only put at the back of the line, they're finding that line is moving backwards for them, as all these other people continue to fall in front of them.
Right. And so why this hasn't been sorted, Reagan deserves a lot of blame, when he had his amnesty. And this is another big thing that bothers me so much. I think it was 86, turned California blue. You cannot have an amnesty unless you have a border. It just doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. And it's completely idiotic. It's like, it's having like a broken jar and you keep filling it up. It's just, you got to have a border first. And then you can, I'm not saying you should have an amnesty, whatever. I'm just saying, logically, just as a starting point, even if you're going to think about it, you got to first have a border.
Yeah. And for those that don't remember, it was 86. And effectively, at the time, there was a raging discussion around illegal immigration. And Reagan struck a deal whereby anybody who was here illegally, who'd been living here continuously for more than 10 years, was granted citizenship. And in exchange for that, he had a promise from the Democrats that the border would be completely closed down. That, okay, we'll allow for this population that's been living here, has built a life, we'll give them citizenship and everything shuts off. And Democrats reneged, of course, as they would obviously do. They reneged on that agreement, and nothing's ever been the same since. It was the greatest failing of Reagan's presidency. Unfortunately, to my mind, a failing that's so great that it overshadows the other wonderful things that he did, because it fundamentally altered California, and it's now carried forward to today where it's fundamentally altering our country.
Right, but it was so obvious from the start. Like you border first, and then we'll talk about the other
Exactly.
thing. And, to be perfectly fair, I mean, you do need to find a solution at some point for a lot of problems. I mean, I wish these problems didn't exist, but they do exist. So you got to treat people like people, they're humans, and you got to figure out a way to do this. I mean, some guy who's been around for 20, 30 years. It's not really fair to send them back, but you can't have that discussion is what I'm saying, until the border is closed. Then you have that discussion. And, Trump tried to do it. They stopped him. I think he probably didn't give it enough attention. He, should have put his foot down. I'm talking way back in 2017. I know he had Paul Ryan and all these troublemakers. But I don't see it again. It's such a horrible situation. But bottom line is you won't get anywhere until you finish that border. That's the first thing you do.
One of the things that surprised me, and you're 100% right, and I'll stop for a moment because you are absolutely right. And as you said, Democrats always have a much longer mindset than I think the GOP does. GOP tends to be reactive and just kind of totters from crisis to crisis, many of which are manufactured, whereas the DNC and the probably above the DNC is really kind of a tool. There's a whole element, I think, above them, but that creates these long-term strategies and then is extraordinarily effective at implementing them. And that's part of what this is showing, is that this whole infrastructure that's in place that many of us weren't even fully cognizant of, and it has been in place for some time. As you said, it wasn't just the cartels bringing people up here. It was money from the United States that established the infrastructure to do it. And as a guy, Representative Lance Gooden had been trying to make some noise on this, and had even introduced a bill to cut off funding to the NGOs. And he got no support, no traction. It was a bill that most people have never even heard of. He also tried to get answers from Alejandro Mayorkas on this, and again, got no real help, also no real answers. And what he noted when his most recent letter, he's tried several times with Mayorkas, his most recent letter noted NGOs receive hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars through federal grants to provide free food, lodging, transportation, to be released anywhere they want in the United States. He continues, NGOs simply tell the Department of Homeland Security how many illegal aliens they encounter, and funding will be awarded without any documentation or receipts. And he's been trying to get an answer for this from Alejandro Mayorkas for probably a year and a half now, with no response whatsoever. And kudos to him for trying to get an answer. But where's the rest of the GOP picking up this issue and making it publicly known? Because all of this died because there was no publicization of what he was doing. There was no assistance with what he was doing. The GOP did nothing to help him out. Yeah, just once again, where is the GOP in this?
Yeah, well, they can't even get him impeached. They fail on that vote as well. The funding of these outside organizations is such. You're absolutely right. Good on this guy for bringing it up. But this should be front and center, and not only as far as the border is concerned, as far as everything is concerned. What is the government doing funding all kinds of groups, mainly leftist groups, from all different directions? So let's look at some examples. Remember when we did our whole Ukraine deep dive, and I'm talking before the war, before all that, the activities of the U.S. Embassy over there in 2014 when they had the coup, and in subsequent years. And through some of these documents that got released, you could see how many of these just NGOs that just they're left, right, and center, they could just, they just funded for this, that, and the other. What are they doing? They need to just limit themselves to whatever the U.S. Embassy is supposed to do in terms of, talking to the Ukrainian government, issuing visas, and, that's it. What on earth is going on with that? you have it, of course, with Fauci. He has all his outside organizations that he funds to, do things like funnel money to the Wuhan lab. We had it with the censorship complex. Remember the CISA and the lists we got out of that they were working with this group and that group, and they all have these Orwellian names and so on. So the general idea, I know we're going really wide here, but the general idea of a government funding all these third parties is just madness to me. It shouldn't happen at all. And if it does have to happen, it should be absolutely minimal, but it seems to be extremely widespread.
No, I think you're 100% right to go wide on this, because that is the fundamental problem, is that our government has the ability to be funding all of these organizations, NGOs and other items, and they always happen to have a left-leaning ideology, and the GOP never happens to be part of that funding. It always seems to be coming out of left-leaning. Well, let's face it, the DOJ, the State Department, etc., all have an ideologically left bent to begin with. But that's where these funds are coming from, and there shouldn't be any of it. The first thing that leapt to mind when I, started actually looking at this document and this division within the State Department, the first thing that came to my mind was Eric Holder. And the reason that I say that is, for people who are unaware, there was something called the DOJ Slush Fund. And what it was, and actually in some respects, the amounts dwarf what's going on right now. Back to the financial crisis, when a lot of the financial firms started settling with the DOJ, for various wrongdoings, and you can disagree if they'd actually done wrong or not, but it doesn't change the fact that enormous amounts of money were being transferred in fines to the DOJ, a sum total of $110 billion. The DOJ started awarding out some of these damages, not to the taxpayers that were supposedly harmed in the financial crisis, but to special interest groups. And it wasn't small amounts. It was billions of dollars that they were funneling to groups of their choice. And by groups of their choice, I'm talking about things like La Raza, Acorn, etc. We're receiving the funds directly from the DOJ. And in some cases, there was incentivization. There was both incentivizing going on, where these groups could actually lobby the DOJ and say, hey, we want to be included as to have an ability to get some of these proceeds. And the DOJ would provide incentives to the donating parties that if they made concurrent donations to some of these groups, they would count their contributions on a 2-for-1 basis. So there'd be a multiplier effect. So it's this enormous distortion of the government coming in and taking taxpayer money and then using it for political purposes. And those political purposes always go in one direction. It's always on the left. But, again, back to your larger point, what in the heck is the government doing operating on such a large-scale politicized basis with these funds? I mean, there needs to, I don't know yet what the answer or the mechanism is, but there needs to be an addressment of it, because this problem is fundamental. Everybody wonders how all these leftist groups can afford to do the various things they do. And fingers get pointed at George Soros all the time. And yeah, he's a big funder, but he's a pittance compared to our own government and the donations that our own governments make into these groups.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And look at it in the sector, the virology sector. Coming back to COVID here, $60 billion is what the NIH sits on.
Yeah,
that's just. I think we worked it out once. That's 3/4 of the world's countries have smaller budgets, like the entire country, than what the NIH alone burns through every year. And so much of that money goes to, some guy's pet project, some here, some there, and whatever. And then, of course, EcoHealth being one of those. So, but yeah, that's just one example which comes to mind because we talk about it a lot. But it's everywhere. That's the problem.
That's the problem. It's everywhere.
I think the solution has to be that no more funding of third-party organizations. Now, I know people will find workarounds and this and that, but why should the government be paying any third party? I mean, yeah, sure, sometimes you need a plumber to come in to fix the plumbing or whatever, okay? But that's a contractor. That's not really a third party that you give money to, on some pet project. We should be able to draw a line between those two things. It might not be the clearest line in every case, but the problem is so overwhelming that it should be easy to take a big cut out of the this external funding, and that would help hugely with the budget, given how widespread this problem is.
It would make an immense difference. But of course, the problem that we now face is that's embedded governmental infrastructure that's in place. And once you've gained another department, the government always wants to grow. Like the idea of trying to cut back on this is going to be, it's an enormous challenge. But I think that if that's something that if Trump wins, it should be a huge area of focus for his administration because it accomplishes a number of things if you actually have any success. It reduces the scale, scope, reach, the political power of these, kind of federal agencies operating under the cover, under the radar politically. And then it reduces these groups. I mean, it's sort of, most people in Washington they're affiliated with government, but they're usually affiliated in some other way. They're not working directly for the government. They're working for all these various agencies, they're consultants, etc. So what we're really touching upon is this infrastructure that's built up around the United States government and operates sort of in the shadows, but everybody knows about it. And they're immensely powerful, and they're powerful because we're giving them the money to be powerful.
Yes, unfortunately, that's so true, and it will be. It's like probably one of the biggest challenges to disentangle, take all that down, because as you say, it's not just money. I know I just mentioned the money here and how much money could be saved, but it's the destruction that's caused by the existence, or the distortions, perhaps I should say, caused by the existence of these groups because of their political messaging and how they. Shift the narrative in a certain direction. I mean, and then of course you got the media coming in for the vicious circle. Coming back to EcoHealth here, so you got a third-party group paid for by the government to do reckless things out in Wuhan, and everyone has to circle the wagons for them because they have a nice name and they have a nice website where they say they want to protect the environment, some kind of Orwellian stuff, but then. Remember when Trump did defund them? And by the way, even they have not, but just to illustrate how big the problem is, like we're talking about defunding, hundreds of thousands of these groups. And the government couldn't even defund EcoHealth. Trump couldn't even do it. Well, he did do it. And then Fauci came back through the back door and gave EcoHealth twice as much money as Trump had taken away. So if you can't even do EcoHealth, what hope is there kind of for the bigger scheme of things? And just coming back to this vicious circle. So they have this Orwellian name and everyone has to say, oh, this is wonderful. And then if you do something about it, like Trump tried to take away their money, then the media comes out and says, oh my God, Trump is taking away money from people who are doing good. And, remember that headline, Scott Pelley, CBS, by defunding EcoHealth, you're stopping the finding of a cure for COVID, rather than maybe you're stopping the creation of COVID. So it's like a perfect storm, and it always goes in one direction. And to be honest, on that, I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, and the left has always done a phenomenal job with names. They recognize the power of words, the power of names, the power of labels. And so they always attach a level of nobility to these things that fundamentally isn't there, but sounds great. I just was looking at the mission statement here for PRM, the division within the State Department, and it reads wonderfully. Their mission statement is to, quote unquote, provide protection, ease suffering, and resolve the plight of persecuted and uprooted people around the world, and then here comes the kicker, on behalf of the American people by working with other governments and international partners. Now, you read that casually and you think, oh my gosh, that sounds fantastic. You read it a little bit more carefully and you see what's actually going on, with international partners. And well, who are those international partners? What are their goals? What are their means of operation? Why aren't they identified? What's exactly going on? Of course, they never want to identify those, but you kind of see what's going on here. The idea behind the UN, in my mind, has always been to elevate itself above the United States, to elevate the UN's laws above the laws of the country in terms of our Constitution, supranational laws versus the Constitution. And that's all part of what's being embodied in this. And it's helped to get us to where we are.